Coming up, the Brooklyn Nets close out their season on the road with a disappointing loss to the 76ers. Is the youth movement enough to sustain the fan base heading into a long off season? We dive in coming up next.
You are Locked On Nets, your daily Brooklyn Nets podcast. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
Yes, my friends, it is the Locked On Nets podcast right here on the Locked On Podcast Network. It's your team, the Brooklyn Nets, every single day. He's Doug Norrie. I'm Adam Armbridge. We thank you, as always, for making us your first listen of the day. We are 100% free on all those great platforms. And let you know, today's episode is brought to you by Monopoly Go. I admit it. I have a competitive side, and it is being a big fan of Monopoly Go. The mobile hit twists the classic Monopoly game, so join your friends and download Monopoly Go now for free on the App Store and on Google Play. And Doug, I'm competitive, and maybe the Brooklyn Nets weren't necessarily as they close out the season here with Philly, but ultimately, this is the end of what was a long and disappointing road 2023-24, finally capped off for Brooklyn.
Yep, Nets saved their worst for last in a season where that was pretty much the theme. Get blown out here by the Sixers on, one of the last day of the NBA season is just a total topsy-turvy mess. If you look across the board, if you're trying to do I'm doing every day, it's like predicting player minutes. It's a total mess. And it's become something of a joke outside of a few teams trying to win, like the Sixers were in this game. Most other teams have basically packed it in, whether they've admitted it, and just, rested all the guys that matter at all, or admitted it a long time ago, like the Nets did, and just kind of didn't really show up. That ends up becoming somewhat of a theme across the board. And it's kind of fitting in some ways that this is how the Nets season ends, right? With essentially a 20-point loss to a team that was missing its best player. And I don't know if it sums up the whole year. I think it's hard to sum up the whole year in one sentence, but it's not surprising that this is how the Nets season ended, because if you've been on this 82 game journey, then you can come and see, you can kind of see it before you actually reach the finish line.
Yeah, and it's tricky too, because this one game isn't the encapsulation of it, but
no,
we've gotten some Noah Clowney, right? And some more Jalen Wilson, Trendon Watford coming on late here. So that youth movement, which you've been talking about, hey, that's good. You can think about what this can look like going forward for this team. But I do think games like these are also the reminder, right? Well, yes, young talent is exciting, and it does provide you something to build around, and you're going to lose a lot of basketball games playing with them. When Noah Clowney officially got into the mix at the end of the year, and thinking, oh, well, he should have been there that much sooner. From a developmental standpoint, that can be true, but there's lumpy games that you're going to take. And, for a team in Philadelphia that had their own injuries, no Joel Embiid in this one, by the way, still handled their business with relative ease. It is a reminder of how far away the Nets were on achieving what was their mission statement coming in. Be competitive, make the playoffs. It's not just that you were X games out in the Eastern Conference from the 10th seed. There's a lot more here that had to be done. Nothing more evident than Mikal Bridges not playing, second half of this game, essentially not getting no Cam Johnson, whether it's injury or otherwise. Dorian Finney-Smith, right? So many veteran players non-functional down the stretch here for a number of reasons.
Yeah, and it's funny because I mentioned being non-competitive. The Nets did win, 6 of their last 10 games, right? So
7-5 in their last 12, baby. Let it cook.
Right. So they did win some of these games. I don't know if that makes it better or worse, right? Because on the one hand, you say to yourself, well, put this together for 6 more games over the course of the season, where we're pulling our proverbial literal, for me, or figurative hair for you out, or no, the other way around.
Pull your hair out, put it in my head.
You wonder, where was this at times, right? Where was this sort of competitive fire for a season that they definitely wanted to keep playing? Because when you look at the end of the regular season for a lot of these teams, you can make a case. It's by the way the NBA is structured, it's obvious. It's oh, Charlotte's sitting other guys. Yeah, they want to lose, right? Oh, Portland's sitting other guys. Yeah, they've been doing that forever. They want to lose. The NBA's incentivizing them to lose these games into what become epic tank-offs. Where the Nets aren't in that mix for even having the excuse behind it, then it just becomes such a harder pill to swallow, right? And that's been one of the bigger problems for the season, is that their motivations were actually of a team that was trying to get into the playoffs, and they really weren't able to. And honestly, they're probably like one of only 2 teams who wanted to make the playoffs or at least the play-in this year and didn't make it. It was them and coincidentally the Rockets. Like
Yeah.
these are the 2 teams that wanted to make the playoffs or minimum the play-in this year, and both fell well short of that goal. I don't know. It's just it means nothing except that these 2 teams, sort of futures in the short term are sort of locked together, right? We know that they're giving the pick over to the Rockets this season. But it also is even almost worse on paper because all the rest of the teams were fine with this, right? Like they looked at it and they're like, we're fine. Don't need to make the playoffs. All good. We're on a different building track and it's good. And then you have this team that just didn't want to do that, but never played like they really, really understood it. And whether it's lack of leadership, we'll talk about that later in the week. Whether it's just like coaching, whether it's talent, whether it's front office, whether it's just a combination of all of it, it just becomes watching this game against the Sixers ends up sort of encompassing kind of all your worst fears, but also maybe dreams of the future for the team.
And you got to remember, too, down the stretch of the season, wins against Toronto, against Washington, can put Chicago in there as well, against Detroit, against Toronto again. So some of these wins down the stretch do get clouded into the group of teams that were okay with losing down the stretch. And oh, by the way,
this is why it's so hard to like even go like not hit your preseason your preseason over under and wins when you're trying, because so many teams late are not trying that if you're trying and you're even in striking distance of it, you just almost can't help but get there because all these other teams just have no problem with just walking out of this stuff with losses, except, when you lose to the San Antonios, when you lose to the Charlottes, when you lose to the Detroits, all of which the Nets did over the last part of this season, lose to Memphis, right? They had this run of losing to these teams who would love to give those wins back.
Yep.
Right? They would not want to win these games.
There should be the ability at the end of the season, if you are a team like the Nets who have given away their first round pick, you should be able to buy back wins from other teams that want to give them away at a low cost, just to knock yourself out of that lottery scenario. Say, sorry, Houston, we bought one back from Memphis, one from Detroit over here, and we got ourselves, we finished 13th. I hate to break the news to you. Coming up here in a second, I do have a troubling record statistic here for the overall season where the Nets will finish 32-50, a mere 5.5 games below the over-under mark heading into the year. And we'll also just talk about high level where this team stands as we will watch other teams that were in similar waters head into the play-in tournament later this week. We'll dive in coming up next.
All right, before we get to that, we'll tell you about our friends over at Gametime. Look, when it comes to buying tickets, the last thing you want to do is have this to be difficult. You want this to be fun. You're going to something fun, whether you're going to the game, the concert, the play, whatever, the comedy show, whatever it is. You want the ticket buying experience to be easy, cost-effective, and know exactly what you're going to get. That is what you're going to get with Gametime. Gametime is the best ticketing app out there. Last minute deals. You can save up to 60% off buying last minutes for, like I said, sports, concerts, comedy, theater, etc. You get flash deals. Those are going to be in-app deals on select seats ahead of the game or event. Zone deals. They got all-in pricing. You're going to be able to see exactly what you're going to see when you sit down in your seat. They get the lowest price guaranteed. All kinds of stuff in the New York area too. Pittsburgh Pirates and New York Mets starting at $1 on Gametime. We got Rays at Yankees. That's starting at $14 over at Gametime. So much offered here over on the Gametime app. Take the guesswork out of buying tickets with Gametime. Download the Gametime app, create an account, use the code LOCKEDONNBA for $20 off your first purchase. Terms apply. Again, create an account, redeem code LOCKEDONNBA for $20 off. Download the Gametime app today. Last minute tickets, lowest prices, guaranteed. And we're done with that. We've all been there, either as a player or a fan. It's halftime. The scoreboard's not looking good. We were there with the Nets here today against the Sixers. You're feeling low, not sure you or your team can pull out a win. That's why when you dig deep, you lift up your head and say to yourself, time to get back in the game, pull off some bank heists, and take as much of my friends' money as I possibly can. That's right. Smash hit mobile game Monopoly Go lets you compete with your friends to get the most riches in the biggest empire. It's the Monopoly you love, but on your phone anytime with tons of new twists, including leaderboards, and to compare your progress to your buddies. There's so much to do. You can play countless dynamic Monopoly boards, make your friends bankrupt by smashing their landmarks with a wrecking ball, even charge other players rent for your iconic properties, work with your friends to crack open community chests and tournaments to get extra rewards and climb that leaderboard. Get back out there. Put you on your game face. Download Monopoly Go now, free in the App Store or on Google Play.
All right, so as the Brooklyn Nets season comes to a bit of a disappointing end, 32-50 on the year. I was saying there, a troubling stat to bring into this is, remember 13-10 at the start of the season. You take their end of season record here, 20-15. Go ahead and pull those 35 games out. There's 12-35 roster in the bulk of the season. When the games mattered the most, when they were working towards the trade deadline, making critical decisions. And when you're getting the most out of Mikal Bridges at that time, right? We know Cam Johnson in and out of the lineup, some good and mediocre runs for Dorian Finney-Smith. It's weird because I wanted to ask you the question, does it feel like it's enough to see Noah Clowney, to see Jalen Wilson, Trendon Watford, Cam Thomas, right? To see these guys playing in these last handful of games down the year and go, okay, this is what we're looking at going forward, regardless of what the offseason ends up bringing. Or does your mind always cast back to, yeah, but mission statement was competitive, playing for the playoffs with these players, Mikal Bridges, Cameron Johnson, the top two players on our roster. When you really examine it from that standpoint, there is a high degree of disappointment and underachievement this season for the Brooklyn Nets.
I think you can't look at it as anything more than a consolation prize. I think it's the only thing that took this season from like an F- to like a D+ or something like that. And I don't think you can really go higher than that. And I think that that's just being realistic looking throughout the entire landscape of the season. It's almost like in some ways, look, we did how many we watched every single game, obviously 5 days a week with the podcast. We talked more Nets than anybody else really probably out there, right? Save a few people. I'm not sure there was many more people on record more than us around the Nets. At some point in the season, I don't know exactly what the day was, though it'd be funny to go back and pinpoint it. At some point, we basically called the ball on the season, right? Yeah. So at that point, it really was the F-. Like after that, this was just a little bit on the end that didn't make it all negative. But I think if we holistically look at the entire season, this was nothing more than just a little bit of a Band-Aid on what was as bad as we ever could have predicted.
Sure.
And that's really the state of the whole season. Now, going into next season, are we excited for Noah Clowney? Sure. Right. You get a little something out of Watford at the end. Yeah. Probably be nice to bring him back. Do we see a little more Cam Thomas making some strides? Yeah. But you could go on the other side of the ledger here with just as many things that you're concerned about. The play of Mikal Bridges fell off a cliff precipitously over the last half of the season. Cam Johnson was almost nowhere to be seen for too many long stretches. I just don't
commitments before the year started versus ending up firing John Vaughn, right?
I think it was just so bad for so long that we kind of just got used to that. So that when it got a little better, it was enough of that wind in the sail to push to get to the end of the season. But it doesn't make the season end on a high note by any means. Does that make sense? It was just enough to make it so that we weren't just sitting here in the middle of the ocean drifting aimlessly.
Well, I was going to say, because it's a good analogy. It's, enough wind in the sails, so it starts pushing you in the direction of shore, and you can see land. But by the way, when the season ends, you're not 2 feet on the ground. You're somewhere maybe in the shallows thinking like, hey, if I jump out of this water, is there any sharks there waiting to, nip at my ankles? Like, you're still not there. So you end up being left in a bit of an ambiguous spot from that regard. And from a high level too, because we have the NBA playoffs, the play-in tournament's going to kick off here. Eastern Conference, we're going to talk a little bit more about it later in the week when we talk about Chicago and Atlanta. Like, a reminder here, the Atlanta Hawks, the Nets beat them in back-to-back games going back to the end of February, beginning of March. And then over the next 16 games, it was a 10-6 run for the Atlanta Hawks. You take away the last, 6-7 games here when things didn't matter as much necessarily, could have been positional, whatever. But it was an achievable goal. Like, I remember you and I talking back then, hey, those 2 games, that's it, man. If you can beat those 2 games against Atlanta, then it's all systems go. And the Brooklyn Nets immediately eroded those 2 wins over the next handful of games for themselves. And that I think is also a stark contrast and reminder here. Everything was happening, didn't look like you were going to achieve it, whatever. And after a muddled year with bad decision-making and underperformances, you were in this spot to make the back half of this season a real run and a real push and something that would actually have gotten you to shore, that would have made the offseason one where you say, okay, what's the next stepping stone here? They fell apart. Right. They effectively fell apart when they needed it most. And I think that speaks a lot to talent level and where your expectations had to be set. They couldn't do it. It was not an achievable goal for Mikal Bridges and Cam Thomas for as good as he was this year with Cam Johnson, Dorian Finney-Smith, and others. They were never going to get over that hump. And I think we kind of knew that, but they were always giving you that breadcrumb to say, oh, no, but maybe we'll do something. And that to me is just so disappointing to have circled those dates on the calendar. I know I did it specifically. I think Doug, to be fair, had said that they weren't gonna do it. They weren't gonna make the play-in tournament. But I circled those games and I say, hey, you win these, man, and it really gives you a shot. And they immediately dumpstered that, and that's going all the way back to the beginning of March. That's how long it's been since they effectively ended the joy or excitement or interest around this season.
For sure, they went 9. They lost 9 of their next 11. That
Right.
was the end of the season, basically.
Right.
And it was those games that I mentioned at the top of the podcast, like losses to Charlotte, like losses to Memphis, right? Losses to San Antonio, that overtime loss to San Antonio in there, and it was a tough stretch, right? They played a lot of good teams during that time too. I mean, they actually beat Philly during that. That was without Embiid and without Maxey, I think, that game too. But but 9, going 9 and going 2-11, 2-9 in that those next 11 games, sinking the season. Yeah, that was the time where it was like, hey, now it's done, right? Like those breadcrumbs that we had been kind of just holding on, or just enough, or maybe the motivations will be there. These other teams are going to take a step back, but it just ended up they just weren't able to do it. And it's so funny about how this Nets, because like when we really look back, and I'm going to talk a lot about this tomorrow, I think, so I don't want to go too far into this, but when we look back at the season, it's so, the reason you get here is because you don't actually know exactly what or who to blame, right?
Yep.
Like, or let me put it, everything's to blame. So it's like you don't know what's to blame, but actually
You're
everything's
confused
to
because
blame.
there's so many things to blame. You can't even narrow it down to which is the
It's
most
literally
important or
blame
critical.
everything, literally everything. That's the testament to like how it all went wrong. It went wrong on so many levels that actually picking the most wrong thing is difficult. Making a list of wrong things is not difficult. That list we have plenty of ammo for. It's the picking the most wrong thing is the most difficult thing. And then you say, well, okay, well then it goes all the way up to leadership at the top, right? If everything goes wrong, then it's a failing of leadership or failing of the organization on the very highest level. Because other than that, when you can make the list of like everything all the way down the chain, it actually is much harder to make a list of what went right. And that list is incredibly short. If there's even anything at all, like except for Noah Clowney at the end. And then I know people will say, well, you should have brought him up earlier. I'm still fine with it, with where they brought him up. I don't think that they missed an opportunity there necessarily, but in general, it's sort of a testament to, I mean, the theme of the Nets, I'm going long here, but the theme of the Nets over the last 3 years, basically 4 years, is literally, if it could go wrong, it will have gone wrong.
Yeah.
Like that has been the theme. Go all the way back. There's really, since, I don't even want to pinpoint the day, but if it could go wrong, it basically did for this Nets team. And then you think to yourself, well, we're moving on to this new era. KD, Kyrie, Harden, they're out of here. And then everything goes wrong again. So it's like, well, what's happening here? Because that's just been the theme on every level: player, personnel, social, societal, on court, off court. It all went wrong. And this year, there was no off court like controversies, but there didn't need to be, because everything on the court went wrong anyway.
And that's why coming up here in a second, we'll not only let you know that, yes, Sean Marks will be back as the GM for the Brooklyn Nets, but the question about whether or not, through all of the issues internally, Cam Thomas ended up being the one true bright spot through 82 games. We'll get into that coming up next.
All right, before we get to that, tell you about our good friends over at Prize Picks. Prize Picks, America's #1 fantasy sports app. More than 3 million members over there on Prize Picks. That's because they made daily fantasy the easiest it could be. All you're doing on Prize Picks, you're picking more or less on 2 or more player stats. You match and watch the winnings roll in. We get into the playoff action here. You can win up 100 times your money on Prize Picks as you and the world's best players take the game to a new level during the basketball postseason. You go 100x on your money with as few as 4 correct picks. You can turn $10 into $1,000. With NBA, you go get a hockey action going as well. MLB, obviously. All you're doing, like I said, on Prize Picks, you're going more or less on those stats for the players: points, rebounds, assists, blocks, steals. NHL, you're going goals, assists. It's the easy stuff over there. That's what Prize Picks has made it super easy. They made it super fun. They want you to get in on the action. You can win up to 100 times your money. All you're doing is you're downloading the app today, the Prize Picks app. You use the code LOCKEDONNBA. You're going to get a first deposit match up to $100. Once again, download the app today. Use the code LOCKEDONNBA for a first deposit match up to $100. Prize Picks. Pick more, pick less. It's that easy.
So as we tie a bow on not only the Philadelphia loss for the Brooklyn Nets, capping off also the season for the Nets, play-in tournaments are coming up, Chicago versus Atlanta. We have a lot of stuff that we're going to be doing from a show standpoint, talking about some of those high-level names, Trae Young, off-season narratives, guys we're going to watch for here, teams that, oh, by the way, I'll tell you real quick here, Doug, not to go off book, but Chicago being in the play-in tournament, I mean, that's a real slap in the face to the Brooklyn Nets. This is an old carcass of a roster that they just kept dragging back out on the court, and they made the play-in tournament over the
also missing their most expensive player. Say what you will, they missed their most expensive player for almost as much time as the Nets missed their most expensive player. So right. This is where you start running out of excuses. But I digress.
Yeah, anyway,
this has been.
I just, it popped into my head looking around the league and realizing, oh, there's another reason why this is a disappointing season for the Brooklyn Nets. You failed to pass the Chicago Bulls. I do want to briefly mention, obviously, Sean Marks, all indications. Again, Brian Lewis, we said this the other day. Brian Lewis, well connected to the organization. They keep just dripping and drabbing out little narratives such as, we believe in Ben Simmons and we support him next season. We also believe in Sean Marks. He will return. Like never a better time than as you're working your way through the last 2 games of the year to go ahead and let the fan base know, hey, don't have any questions or curiosities. We already know what we're doing here. But the Cam Thomas piece, I think, is the other most interesting narrative out of this season because he's going to become a real focal point, trades or otherwise. He'll be extension eligible off of his rookie contract going into next season. A lot of things to figure out here. Do you believe that he showed enough, not even for the organization, for you personally, where you would say, okay, he can be a member of whatever version of this team we want to have going forward? Or is it really about elevating his profile to make him attractive to utilize in the offseason?
Yeah, I think he showed more than enough to be like an everyday rotation player. If that's the question, I think I think that is pretty much solved. I don't know. I mean, the question is there.
You don't go full starter.
Yeah, starter.
Yeah.
Sorry.
I mean, exactly team-based. Nets team, obviously.
Look, here, this is where this always gets screwed up because, like, if you put Cam Thomas on, this is not a knock on him, but if you put Cam Thomas in the Celtics, would he start? No, right? Like, he wouldn't start for the Celtics. He wouldn't start for the Nuggets. He wouldn't start for the best teams in basketball. Right. I think that's not a hot take. Like, that's very obvious, right? But is he a starter?
A team that wasn't one of the best in basketball.
Okay, so right, exactly. So now where the Nets are, like, is he a starter for the Nets? Yeah. By the way, I'm not even sure like Bridges wouldn't start for the Celtics. So right. It's like I'm not even like this is not even anti-Cam Thomas. No single Nets player would start for the Celtics. Now that and then so you then just go look at all the team and you can sort of like do. Sometimes it's best to sort of experiment that way around where players stand. Is you go put them on some of the best teams and like ask where they would fit in on some of those best teams because those are the best teams in basketball. Now that being said, for where the Nets are, yeah, of course, like they're going to desperately needed his scoring this year, and they're going to desperately need his scoring next year. Like it's short of a trade for a guy like Donovan Mitchell, or you mentioned Trae Young, although that's not a name that's really been connected too much. But I'm not saying that the Mitchell thing is a done deal either. But short of a trade for sort of these like high level scorers, the Nets are going to be in a lot of the same position that they were in this year, which is very few guys who can score. And if anything, guys like Bridges went the completely wrong direction on being able to score. So at that point, Cam Thomas is going to be one of the more important players for the Nets going into next year. So I think his role on the team, short of being traded or like I said, bringing in one of these other guys where he would actually have trouble pairing with, right? Like low defense on ball guard. Yeah. That's going to be hard for him. But short of that situation, I think like his role is pretty much, it would seem to be set in stone.
And that's going to be interesting for this offseason. It's a really good note about if you're looking and hearing and watching for rumors, players that get mentioned potentially, and you meant Trae Young's that's not really a part of this journey. Donovan Mitchell is the high level one, but his names get mentioned. Think about what it would mean as far as pairing with, Cam Thomas in the backcourt or not, because if it feels like it's round peg, square hole, then maybe consider the idea that Cam Thomas is not as much a part of the future as if it was a player that feels like he'd be a natural complement to him, right? And then you build it out another layer too when we talk about Noah Clowney and his performance and seeing him play well with a Nicholas Claxton. Okay, how are we trying to build out this roster to make it a viable option for the Brooklyn Nets? I find all of it fascinating. And then I think the other thing we talk about, and we'll talk about this offseason, is did this young core, Jalen Wilson, Cam Thomas, I'll put Noah Clowney and Nicholas Claxton, let's say those 4 guys, is it enough based on what we know of Sean Marks, and you'll talk more high-level leadership on the next episode, is that enough that we saw from them to squint on like what that could be going forward? Because when you see a loss like this against Philadelphia at the end of the year or some of these other blowouts, you're still going to need 20 games into next season before you cement what these young players are, and Trendon Watford as well, what they are relative to this team, right? Like, I think that's the downside of this. You get through a rough year, and we won't know until we see the product and probably the first quarter of next season if these guys are going to live up to whatever new expectations we set for them.
Well, the good news on guys like Clowney and to a lesser degree Jalen Wilson, who is basically just a role play, I think just kind of a role player-ish guy, is that those guys, at least Clowney, let's say, Clowney is sort of independent of whoever comes in here. I think he's shown that he can kind of pair with almost anybody, and that's good. Like that's a very good thing. Like sort of like Bridges on some level, where it's like, I don't know, bringing like literally anybody, and the concept here is that Bridges can play with them, right? Like Bridges can, say whatever it is for as much as his value took a hit here. Like he's still his style of play and his build and everything fits in with most anybody who comes in. Same with Clowney, right? It's like, oh, he can play the 4 probably, right? Yeah. He was at one point, he went 2 for 4 in this game. It's like 36% for 3 as a 19-year-old. Okay, you can live with that, right? Like that's great news. Cam's a little harder in that respect, but okay. But and then Jalen Wilson, you're like, role player, fine. It's hard to look at that group and call that a core, I think, because that means something like it's a core is good and that core is just guys pretty much. But I think the good news is that those guys, at least those last couple guys on the list, it's like that doesn't matter. Bring in anybody and you're not worried about whether or not they fit. Like think about like Simmons and Claxton. It's like, oh, it doesn't fit together, right? It just doesn't work, can't do it. Someone's gonna have to not play. And even honestly, Claxton is not like that. Like he's, as we go into the off season thinking about him, it's like he doesn't pair with exactly everybody,
right?
But would play for most teams. So I don't know. It does lead to some questions. I'm not sure if you feel great about it still. They need to bring in high level talent. They just really don't have that next top 25 guy right now, and that's what you lack if you want to take the next leap for NBA. You need at least one of those guys. They don't have it. That's might end up being the story of the offseason.
Let's end on a high note here. The season is over. Noah Clowney got some run. Plant your flag right now, Douglas. Starting powered forward for the Brooklyn Nets next season, game 1. Yes?
Yeah, I think he starts.
Perfect. Look at that. Guys, guess what? Point stop. Guess what we just did? We just found the starting power forward for the Brooklyn Nets. 19 years old, youth, perimeter shooting, versatile. Stop it. Season's a success. I say give it an A. I give the entire season
I think the reason I feel okay about that is that that's funny. Actually, I say this now, but I'm probably erasing some other contextual things too quickly. I would say, okay, I'm going to walk this back a little. I'm going to say, I'm actually going to change it and say no. I take it back. Sorry. I'm going to take it back and say no. I'm too easily forgetting guys who are just like clearly on the team next year who just weren't here now, like Cam Johnson, like Dorian Finney-Smith, who I'd be shocked if Clowney started over them. So I'm at least to start the season. I'm not saying that like it won't end that way, but game 1, veterans, higher paid guys, older, setting the tone. Okay, I take it back. No, I don't think he's starting. My bad. I was kind of forgetting these other guys were on the team because they just haven't played in a while.
Right. If you're watching the last game of the season, you go, well, based on who I saw on the court, of course he is. And I think, the contextual on it here too, for me, just that, okay, did you go get Donovan Mitchell in the offseason and give a bunch of draft picks up? That's going to affect the hierarchy here. If you go with wanting some of these young players to play more next year and our timeline of waiting one more season, then I don't think it's hard to say Dorian Finney-Smith is gone and then you plug Clowney in to start, and maybe you start bumping Cam Johnson down to the 3 in terms of your starting lineup, and Mikal maybe in the backcourt alongside of Cam Thomas, right? I mean, these are all things we can talk about in the offseason, but how do you construct a little bit stronger starting 5 unit? And we always say complementary basketball. How are you building your bench? Who's coming off of there, et cetera? So it'll be fascinating to see. I don't know what they're going to do, but based on what our expectations are, even if you went and got a star this offseason, I would say that Noah Clowney should be starting day 1 next season, because that's the best path forward to get him where you want him to be. And I think Nets fans would be high level disappointed if we start getting the rumblings of a Cam Thomas type development track for Noah Clowney as we get into next year.
I would say that that's already off the table. I think he's like for sure minimum a big part of the rotation. I'm only just stopping short of the starting day 1 because there's other guys here who have just been in the league longer and make more money. And that stuff ends up kind of mattering a little bit, at least like for appearances to start the season. And it's like not a knock on Clowney. It's like, that would kind of make sense to me.
Headline, but Doug Norrie does not believe in Noah Clowney rookie. Says huge mistake from organization to believe in 19-year-old. I think that was my takeaway.
That's a good headline. All right, we're going to get out of here. Much appreciate everyone that's been along this 82-game ride with us. Look, it's not going to stop here. We're 5 days a week, all the way through the playoffs, talking Nets. We got tons of stuff. We'll talk about the organization this week. We'll talk about the new coaching, the rumors that are being floated around there. We're going to talk playoff basketball as well. We're going to give out season grades for some of these guys. Go a little more in depth on each player, too, sort of like what needs to happen for them next year. So tons of stuff coming down the pike here for Locked On Nets.
Here we go. The world is spinning. When it stops, it's just beginning. Sun comes up, we laugh and we cry. Sun goes down, we all die. Davy Chase.
Oh, one of the all-time great poets. We'll be back again tomorrow talking more Brooklyn Nets basketball.
Basketball, end of season basketball, yeah.